Hello, fellows. Today, the topic is the global economy and the pandemic. Let me highlight a couple of points. Uh, as we will see, there remains great uncertainty about the unfolding of the crisis, and prospects vary greatly across countries. The recovery is bound to happen at very different paces. And the divergence of per capita incomes in the world is rising as an aftermath of the pandemic. As we'll see as well, the pandemic will leave scars in labor markets and in income distribution. And policies to heal and recover will be fundamental. Let me give you a picture of the trajectory of GDP in these countries as displayed in the IMF's World Economic Outlook update last January. They came this week with a new forecasts, and we will display them in a minute. But the point that I want to call your attention to here is the fact that uh, everywhere in the world there is a race between vaccination and the virus spread. That's the main dispute establishing the prospects for differentiated growth among the countries. And obviously, for that reason, there is a great deal of uncertainty around this forecast. Greater success with vaccinations and therapeuticals and additional policy support could improve outcomes, while any slow vaccine rollout, virus mutations, as we have seen, including more recently in Brazil, and as well, premature withdrawal of policy support can worsen outcomes. And on top of that, as we shall see, if downside risks were to materialize, a tightening of financial conditions could amplify the downturn at a time when public and corporate debt are at record highs worldwide. This week, in the April 2021 World Economic Outlook, the IMF projected global growth for this year, global growth, at 6%, moderating to 4.4% next year. This conveys a light upgrade for 2021, reflecting the positive effects of the onset of vaccinations in some countries, plus additional policy support since the end of 2020 in economies such as the United States and Japan, as we saw the recently approved President Biden's fiscal package. And as expected, an increase in contact intensive activities as the health crisis wanes in those places where the race is being gained by vaccination. And obviously, in the other place, additional measures to contain the spread of the virus may dampen activity. The chart is quite interesting because it tells us a couple of things. Let's see. Look, this is the case of China, and look, the dotted lines represent the GDP trajectory for these three groups of countries: China, emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, and the advanced economies. They depict the would-be trajectory of GDP according to the forecasts presented by the IMF in January of last year, 2020. And then this chart compares the new trajectories, including what happened in 2020. And as you can see, China was obviously the first case in and first case out. As you saw in the chapter of the book, the whole thing is about the containing, the flattening the pandemic curve, the infections, to minimize the impact, the need to use the existing healthcare capacity, and also flattening the recession curve. That is to say, the several packages that have fiscal and parafiscal and monetary and financial package that have been implemented. We will have some figures on that down the road to, let's say, to compensate partially for the downward trend of the containment measures. C is the state, is the public sector acting as the ultimate insurer against catastrophes, as it is the case of the coronavirus, of the pandemic. And so China was able to contain the spread of the virus, and that's why it went like that. But note the following: even China, almost a perfect V, will not escape entirely unscathed from the coronavirus, as the worst performance of the rest of the world will also weigh a bit on the trajectory of the GDP of China over the following years. Also, keep in mind that the yellow, the emerging markets and developing economies, this is excluding China, is an average, and this hides very differentiated performance among the emerging markets and developing economies. Latin America has been hard hit, whereas the successful cases of containment of the virus in Asia, I have in mind here, it's Singapore, it's Korea, it's Taiwan, China, it's Vietnam, and others, managed to let's say to contain the depth of the crisis because of the less need of containment, or they adopted very effective, as I explain in the chapter of the book, the most successful case of containment have had a component of testing, testing, tracing contacts, isolating contacts. So this selective procedure was very much effective in avoiding the full dissemination. And but of course, they require the government capacity to monitor, to do its job, and also a very well diffused use of technology so as to allow the tracking of the disease and people infected and so on. Everyone has to have a cell phone and so on. And you will not find that in all countries. And not to speak of the different posters that governments had, as unfortunately, for instance, the federal government in Brazil, the president, did not take an attitude of harmonizing and getting together the subnational entities to do their job. So it ended up remaining in the hands of governors or municipalities, and a half-baked kind of containment. And it's not by chance that the pace of infection ended up generating new mutants and new variants. And now Brazil is plagued with high speed the dissemination of the virus, of different variants of the virus, while the vaccination is the second in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of a share of the population, but it's still not enough to contain the virus dissemination. And also the attitude of the leaderships made a huge difference. The examples preaching the containment and the stay-at-home policies in some countries like New Zealand informed and influenced the behavior of the citizens. Whereas in the case of Brazil, again, the attitude by the president ended up influencing negatively many people in the population. This happened as well to some extent here in the US. But in any case, as you can see, the loss of GDP as compared to the trajectory envisaged in 2020 is something permanent. Even if you return to growth in the following years, but over time, the whole world will be at the levels of GDP lower than otherwise, than what it would be the case without the pandemic. And this appears in the following statistics that I'm going to mention now. The 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 projected recovery in growth this year follows the severe collapse in 2020. The estimated collapse, the statistics are still being reviewed and so on, was somewhat less dire than previously projected. So now the current estimate is that the downfall of GDP in the global economy last year was minus 3.5%, whereas back in October, for instance, the expectation was that the collapse would have been even deeper, minus 4.4%. The second half of last year exhibited some stronger than expected growth, but still, it remains the worst peacetime global contraction since the Great Depression. Now, what the chart is telling you is that because of the partial nature of the rebound, over 150 economies are expected to have per capita incomes below their 2019 levels in 2021. Then in 2022, that number declines, but only modestly to around 110 economies. In a nutshell, the projected cumulative output loss over 2020-2025 relative to the pre-pandemic projected levels remains substantial. In January, it was estimated by the IMF as something around $22 trillion. And with a huge differentiation, as you can see in this chart. The strength of the projected recovery varies significantly across countries, with a large difference in projected output losses relative to the pre-COVID forecast. China returned to the pre-pandemic projected level in the fourth quarter of 2020, ahead of all large economies. The United States is projected to surpass its pre-COVID levels this year, well ahead of the euro area, but still with losses relative to the pre-pandemic forecast. But as you can see, still in 2024, the projected GDP level, even for the US, is still in the pandemic size. With advanced economies in general expected to recover faster, progress made towards convergence over the last decade is at risk of reversing. Remember the discussion that we had at the very beginning of the course on emerging markets and developing economies, apparently until the global financial crisis, particularly in a fast trajectory of convergence, or in most cases, convergence of per capita income, which receded a bit since the global financial crisis, but it was still there in positive terms. Well, the pandemic is pulling back, bringing a retrocess in that convergence. The over 50% of emerging markets and developing economies that were converging towards advanced economies in terms of per capita income over the last decade, the 2010s, they are now expected to diverge over the 2020-2022 period. Okay? The faster recoveries in advanced economies are partly due to their more expensive policy support. We'll see figures on that. And quicker access to vaccines relative to many developing countries. Indeed, the refugee of countries into their own individual capacity to and willingness to access vaccines has been very differentiated among advanced economies and non-advanced economies. One point, oil exporters and tourism-based economies face particularly difficult prospects given the subdued outlook for oil price in the medium term and an expected slow pace of normalization of cross-border travel. Tourism needs to have confidence in vaccination on both sides of the equation, which makes the double the challenge. And still, let me show you as well this interesting uh, other measurement of the medium-term output losses by comparing the one associated with the COVID-19 with the output losses that occurred with the global at the time of the global financial crisis. And as you can see, the emerging markets and developing economies, which suffered less in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, are the ones now feeling the highest impact on because of the COVID, particularly the low-income countries. The low-income countries are being are having losses expected to be largest. Okay, now let us think of which key factors are have shaped not only the crisis, but also the recovery, and why exactly they have varied so much among the countries. Now, obviously, the first item of those is controlling the virus, right? That's the number one central target to pursue, because, well, not only because of the risks of in deaths and so on, but also because that's the way to limit the economic damage. Look, even if, let's say, and you saw in the chapter of the book, a apparent discussion on whether there would be a trade-off between dealing with the pandemic and the economic side. The fact of the matter is that if the pandemic is out of control, the behavior of the population will remain avoiding contact-intensive activities, which is the core of the core economic place through which the COVID became a crisis. And even if, regardless of whether you have legal orders, mandaments to contain, like we are watching now in France, and you saw it in several places at different times, and so on. Even if you don't have that, definitely most rational people and not the crackpots will avoid the contact intensive activities, the service, restaurants, movies, traveling, planes, and so on. So if the virus keeps disseminating, the retrenchment of activity in service, in contact intensive service, I'm not talking about the technology service like the one that we are using right now, but on the contact intensive service, there will remain the retrenchment. So the first thing to do is to contain the virus. I put this chart just to call attention to the fact that there are multiple channels of COVID impact on the economies. Even in the case of countries where deaths have not been that high, but still you had a dire economic performance last year because of other reasons. We will see that tourism-dependent countries remittance-dependent countries as well, even if less than what many of us expected. Commodity-dependent countries had for a time, particularly those dependent on oil exports, an impact, and so on. So other factors, there are multiple channels of COVID impact on the economies. And therefore, that's why I put the chart. Now, uh, you saw in the chapter of the book, as I referred to as a COVID as a perfect storm, bringing a perfect storm to emerging markets and developing economies. And when I wrote the chapter, which was sometime last year, the intensity of that perfect storm was even starker than what it ended up being. And why is I called it perfect storm? For two reasons. First, containing the virus tended to be more difficult in emerging markets and developing economies. And let me illustrate this. You don't have, of course, social distancing is harder to obtain if you live in slums, right? And as you can see in this chart, the presence of the share of the population living in slums. This chart shows you the countries with the largest slum populations. Social distancing becomes harder to obtain, right? And also, even if variations among countries, the installed healthcare capacity is smaller, shorter in emerging markets and developing economies. But on top of the difficulties to deal with the pandemic, and the good surprise here, at least we don't know if it's because of inappropriate statistics and or for other reasons, is that we haven't seen in parts of the world, in Africa, for instance, the level of the degree of dissemination that we watched in Latin America, and we're watching as well in Europe and in Eastern Europe. Okay, but on top of the difficulties to deal with the pandemic, intrinsic to developing economies and emerging market economies, those economies suffered shocks coming from abroad, from the global economy, from the advanced countries, even before the virus started to play out. I highlight in the chapter the financial shock that happened in March of last year, when the virus appeared in northern Italy. Then everybody, the markets, realized that the virus was not something circumscribed to China and some Asian neighbors. And the wake-up call led to a rush for cash, a dash for cash. The investors selling everything they had in order to take refuge either in cash or in very liquid US treasuries. And that made a shock in the financial markets in the US and in the other advanced economies, but also into emerging markets, because investors in emerging markets also decided to liquidate positions and come to the US for cash. Just to give an idea, I remember reading, and I quote that, I believe, in the chapter, you had something close to $100 billion leaving emerging markets in 3 weeks of March. That had never happened, anything like this. And then fortunately, we had the response by the Federal Reserve Bank, but also by the European Central Bank, which has, let's say, reversed the financial shock to the extent that even in some respects, the financial markets have even performed better than before. But there was the financial shock. On top of this, three other channels of shocks from the advanced economies. One, the commodity markets. We will see something about it Another one, the impact on tourism, and there are many countries, including emerging market and developing economies, highly dependent on tourism. And third, remittance. Uh, at the time I wrote the chapter, the view was really maybe too gloomy about the impact on remittance by migrants, because my colleagues at the World Bank and I myself uh, underestimate the fact that the fiscal package programs in advanced economies ended up generating, let's say, income transferable by migrants to their original countries. That was the case of the US household checks, for instance. But let's see then these. Okay, I mentioned the flattening the recession curve. Uh, in this chart, I took from the fiscal monitor released yesterday from the IMF. See, I'm bringing you things released this week. The measurement of the size of the fiscal measures to contain the uh, the uh, the recession curve, and because country authorities, as I said, responded with fiscal measures to help both households and firms. The size of fiscal relief package obviously to a large extent reflected the available fiscal space, and therefore they varied across countries. So macroeconomic policy, first I said, contain the virus. Second, implement macroeconomic policies to flatten the recession curve. And that's why I'm showing you this. But look, compare in the chart the size of the fiscal package in advanced economies, which was reached levels more than 16% of GDP. Now compare this with the other regions, right? Different capacities to flatten the recession curve. A third uh, component, a third variable. Oh, okay. Yeah, before that, I also took from the Global Financial Stability Report released this week of the IMF to highlight how, okay, we had a return in some emerging market case, full return, some others only by half or less so of the money that have left. So to have a sign of relief and so on, but everyone is concerned on whether the big fiscal package of Biden and the overperformance of the U.S. economy. I'm not among those who are that much concerned, but they might lead to interest rates going up in the U.S. Faster than what the Federal Reserve Bank itself has manifested. There was a huge debate prior to the approval of the Biden fiscal package. Some economists saying that that would overheat the U.S. economy and actually bring inflation, whereas the Federal Reserve Bank and the government, Janet Yellen herself, have said that given the uncertainty, you better err by doing too much than by doing too little. There is a strong memory of how Obama was shy, how the package of Obama was curbed in Congress right after the global financial crisis, and the U.S. economy definitely at the time underused the fiscal policy space that it had. This time, this mistake is is not the will by the Biden government. And also now the Federal Reserve Bank um has announced last year that instead of tracking inflation and doing something as inflation approached the targets of 2%, President Jerome Powell last year on behalf of the board, announced that the target of 2% is to be treated as an average. So as an average, you may have occasionally the inflation being above or below. So that would, given the current low inflation levels, inflation rates in the US, there would be some space for the inflation go a bit above 2% before the Federal Reserve Bank tightens the financial conditions. And indeed, the members of the Federal of the FONC, of the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve Bank, they display their expectations, and nobody is expecting, at least you will find in my site an article about a possible tug of war between financial markets and the Federal Reserve Bank, because the markets have, as just by some indicators of inflation embedded in interest rates, have started to expect, have become are a lot less optimistic than the Federal Reserve Bank. They are expecting the inflation to go up, and or the risk, the premium risk associated with inflation has gone up. So there is some convincement to be made by the Federal Reserve Bank to financial markets that indeed the likelihood of inflation and a hike in interest rates before the dates that have been included and mentioned in the minutes of the FONC meetings are for real. In any case, the reason why I'm putting this is that we have seen since the beginning of January, since the beginning of 2021, as you can see in the chart, as the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield went up, the bond yield in the markets charged on emerging market local currency government bonds has also come up. So this is the reason why I thought of bringing this. It's a risk. But look at this. This is the third variable to look, to observe, in order to track, in order to measure, in order to understand the ability of a country to contain the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, and also recover fast, which is, and this varies, of course. The countries differ in their relationship with the rest of the world through trade. And I decided to put this chart to call your attention. I don't remember if some chart like this is there in the book, or at least I mentioned the impact on trade. Look at this. This is, of course, what happened to world trade after the global financial crisis. Those of you who may be closely interested in this topic, there is a full chapter in the book dedicated to this, why we have this flattening here. But look at the coronavirus impact and reasonably swift recovery of trade. This comes from the WTO forecast made in October. But I can tell you that the figures are pointing to really a confirmation of this trajectory here. Well, and in the case of, as I said, trade, and in the case of commodity-dependent countries, you have to look at the corresponding commodities regarding which the country is very much sensitive. And as you can see, in the case of commodities, look at the downfall of oil, as one might expect, because containing the pandemic was all about containing mobility, mobility by cars or by travels, by plane, shipping, and so on, and therefore it doesn't surprise that the slump in demand led to a decline in the oil price. There was something else here as well, the dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia that remained for some time. Again, in my website, you will find, if you are interested, pieces on this. But it has reasonably recovered. Interestingly, the metals also recovered fast, and food. So to some extent, this channel of impact was less dire than what I expected, or what many of us expected. It was still negative for emerging markets and developing economies, but it's still not as much deep as we expected. Now look at tourism. Uh, the other channel of impact that made the coronavirus a perfect storm. Well, this, of course, tourism was impacted everywhere, but I call your attention to some countries highly where tourism is very much important. That's the case of the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, uh, Indonesia. Think of Bali here, but also in the European countries and so on. If just to give you a taste, I also added this chart, bringing to Latin America and the Caribbean, how the impact of the tourism collapse in the Caribbean has been really, really dramatic. Well, and then the remittance. As I said, it's even surprised positively in some cases. But look at El Salvador, Guatemala, um, Mexico, Dominican Republic. These are in Jamaica. These are countries where you have many migrants in the U.S., and they clearly benefited from indirectly from the household support in the fiscal measures and so on. Ecuador has more migrants in Europe and in Spain, and see how the impact has been negative. But anyway, now let's start dealing with the scars now, which are we can find the potential a similarity in the types of scars, and of course the depth of the scars will vary according to the dependence of the countries in the global economy regarding each one of them. But first, just to confirm what I was saying at the outset, the COVID-19 is a crisis particularly upon high contact sectors, and you can see this by looking at the uh, the impact of COVID differentiated between high contact sectors and low contact sectors. High contact sectors, hospitality, restaurants, uh, tourism, travels, uh, cultural activities, anything involving agglomeration of people, and personal service. The gyms were all closed, and so on. So the impact across sectors is quite differentiated, as you can see in this chart. Particularly, I find it interesting. See, I took it from the World Economic Outlook released Tuesday. Chapter 2 was released last week. I'm sorry, but the point is that, you know, in the case of the global financial crisis, you didn't have such even the high contact sectors were not very much hit in the global financial crisis. It's completely opposite right now. And the impact on sectors has been very much differentiated. Look at this. The youth and lower skilled workers took some of the hardest hits on average. And women, especially in emerging market and developing economies, also suffered most, as you can see in the chart. And why is that? It's because when you look at the structure of occupation, the presence of women, youth, and of low skilled laborers is higher exactly in contact intensive service. And this therefore led to a gender differentiated impact, but particularly in the case of emerging markets and developing economies, and and on lower skilled workers. Those of us who have occupations, who have skills that allow us to work from home, the kind of jobs that we have, the kind of activities, kind of minimize the effect of the crisis on us. This is not the case of those occupations that need the person to move, to go to the streets, to sell things in the streets, to go knocking door on door or working at other domiciles and so on. So those have been the hardest hit on after the crisis. Let's see. And let me give you the latest estimates by the World Bank about people expected to have to enter extreme poverty in over 2020 and 2021. And the estimate currently is of 90 million individuals. So given the shock, extreme poverty is projected to increase from 12.1% to 14.6%. That's extreme poverty. The moderate poverty is projected to rise from 11.7% to 14.6%. So only a strong recovery will allow those rates to decline significantly. In other, besides this income inequality consequence that may be more durable than what we would wish, we also have the another consequence of the pandemic, which is the acceleration of automation trends. And I brought this chart to make a reference. Again, I included in the readings for this class a text that I recently wrote, published, came out last week, on the scars in the labor market, and I approached there how the not only the change of activities, some of the, in a nutshell, to be very very synthetic about it, not all of the things that have happened with the COVID will return, will be dismissed, will be unwound. Given, for instance, the fact that the productivity and number of hours working from home has been clearly realized. It's not simply the economy of time in transportation, in delocation, but the point is that you have an increase of productivity in the case of working from home. So most likely, the companies, depending on the sectors, of course, will move to some sort of hybrid work organization with physical presence, but not all the time. And this will have implications to the use of the urban space. It will have an impact on the service, restaurants and things like those in central, in urban centers and so on. So there's a lot coming in. And also the automation. Digitalization is a trend that was already there, but it has been, let's say, intensified with the pandemic. Digitalization and automation, whenever applicable. And obviously, the jobs that are less skill intensive and more vulnerable to automation tended to suffer more during the pandemic recession. And see, the social distancing and behavioral change induced by the pandemic intensified the employment drops in sectors such as hotels and restaurants, accommodation and food, wholesale and retail stores, that is a trade, that were typically seen in past downturns, but this time it was even more intensive, as we saw. Whereas the information technology and communication in finance and insurance sectors have actually seen employment growth last year. I saw recently a chart showing wage rising faster in the telecommunication sectors than finance, which is the finance sector was unbeatable in the past. Now it lost the position to technology. And the problem is, as I said, that many of the more impacted sectors, often with fewer jobs amenable to remote work, tend to employ higher shares of youth, women, and lower skilled, contributing to the unequal effects across worker groups. Well, another expected scar from the pandemic, for understandable reasons, is an increase in public and private debts, obviously, as the emergence made it loud and clear, the necessity. And so in the aftermath of the pandemic, many countries will have to contend with high public and private debt burdens. In some cases, possibly too large. Not by chance, low-income countries, indebted countries, the multilateral institutions have insisted that they should look at the possibility of calling for a debt rescheduling. And the G20 last week extended until the end of this year a suspension of debt payment for their official credits that they had approved last year for low-income countries. Now to be seen is what will probably have to be done with respect to the private source of credit to those low-income countries. But the point to make here is that sovereign debt is an issue in small states, for instance, and that dealing with the issue will require an extra focus on revenue mobilization, public finance, and debt management. So to complete the picture on scars, this is my last slide. The new normal, post-pandemic, the new normal. I have already mentioned this, the public and private debt legacy. I have already mentioned this, the increase of inequality and the structural unemployment. I also have referred to this, the technological change spurred by COVID-19. Let me say just a bit on this, the partial reversal of globalization. Let's see, definitely, as we are even watching in the vaccine nationalization and so on. But the point is that the pandemic will probably lead the public sectors to redefine the lines of sectors that they allow for global dependence, to dependence on global value chains. See, the objective, I'm trying exactly to close up now the discussion on attempting to see how the pandemic will interrelate with the trends of globalization that we discussed in the course, right? So definitely in the case of medicaments and medical equipment, countries, governments will make industrial policies, will implement industrial policies as an attempt to reduce the dependence. It was very scary at a certain moment for them. to depend on two countries, on China and India, of making available medical equipments, vaccines, the not the vaccines itself, but some components. In the case of Brazil, for instance, the major limitation now to increase the production of vaccines in Brazil, the CoronaVac, which is a Chinese conceived vaccine, is in the imports of the components from China. So we will see. Macron, the president of France, in a speech last year, as you know, my wife is French, and we accompanied the news, and I watched that speech with her. He said it's time to redefine the strategic sectors, the lines of strategic sectors for France and for Eurozone. The question will be, what is the extent to which, how far will this line of definition of strategic activities will go? Not totally. We will not establish local value chains to produce toys, but definitely, or other things, but definitely in some segments associated with health and so on, we will see some movement like this. Also, see, and I'm talking about a pressure toward reversing partially globalization on top of those that we discussed at a certain moment in the course when I spoke about the technological trends. And that will depend a lot, as the chapter of the book mentions, on how differently are impacted each global value chain, because there is a trade-off. You may cover yourself, cover your global value chain from sudden risks here and there, dependence on too much dependence on one spot, but that comes with a cost if you have to maintain simultaneously several locations and so on. So to be seen, but that's the trend, the partial reversal. But and to finalize, silver lining, which is clearly there has been an increase in perception that mankind needs cooperative solutions to global issues. This is particularly the case in guys at your age, which is great news because you are the future. You know, the pandemic will need a global solution in the following sense. While there is some place out there where the virus is out of control, the whole world will be in peril, because any possibility of someone from that place coming and entering in your place, that might spark new rounds. Particularly if this happens with mutations that may make ineffective the existing vaccines. But the point here is that it's not by chance that the concern with pandemics as a global threat has been mentioned since the beginning of the last decade. I remember bringing my friend Ian Golding, professor at Oxford, who wrote a fantastic book in the beginning of the 2010s. I brought him to speak at the World Bank when I was a vice president. And he listed a series of global challenges going beyond economics. And the pandemics was there, as said. And as we saw, Bill Gates talking about this possibility back in 2015. And I recommend you guys, if a documentary that was available last year, I watched it last year in Netflix, which is titled Pandemic, which was prepared and released in 2019, much prior to any coronavirus. And the documentary is exactly about 6 different bats, 6 different monitorings in different places in the world of scientists and people trying to monitor the risks of having coronavirus. And by the way, one of those 6 is a case of a Lebanese guy who lives in Egypt, and who at the time the documentary was made tracked bats. Yes, those bats, because of the possibility of transmission of virus and so on through bats. Guess what? Almost as a prophecy, we have the COVID-19 coming uh, 1 year later to the documentary. So pandemics is something that would benefit from having coordination and several tracks and monitoring and so on, and in dealing with vaccines, but also climate change. Uh, the climate change will only be dealt with effectively if countries cooperate, like in the Paris Agreement. Cybersecurity, the same, by the same token. If there is, I mean, some cooperation might make individual countries more capable to deter the threats associated with cybersecurity and demographic change. While Europe is getting older, China is getting older, Russia is getting older, Brazil is getting older, whereas there are parts of Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa, where the pace of demographic change is still high. It will be high for some time. So we will have, particularly if climate change affects, particularly in a negative way, some agricultural areas in Africa, some areas of Africa, and so on. That's the irony. Even if the bulk of emissions that put the ozone layer over there came from the industrialized countries over the last century, the most likely the ones who will suffer most will be in the south. It's a tragedy. It's an ironic tragedy. Well, but in that case, it may well be that the push towards people wanting to move and migrate will remain high. And so the attempts a la Trump and putting walls in the frontier, or a la far right wing parties and people in Europe wanting to block and hold people while they're crossing the Mediterranean and so on. Definitely, those will not be the definitive and ultimate solution to the issue of demographic change and the ensuing delocation of people. So some sort of a major agreement will have to be found. Okay? Well, my dear friends, just to remind you of my website, if you go there, stroll down the first page, there is a slot for notifications to be subscribed to notifications. I hope you have all enjoyed, as I did, those weeks and sessions along which we went through uh, globalization and development. And I wish you the best. And of course, we'll still be in contact in our last session, but even later, because this doesn't have to be the last moment in our interaction. It's been a pleasure. Take care.